A brilliant Harvard student found murdered in her locked apartment. Red ochre scattered like an ancient burial. No suspects, no answers, and then nothing for 50 years. What really happened to Jane Britton? This isn't just a murder mystery. It's a haunting that refused to be buried. Stay with us as we uncover the chilling truth behind one of Harvard's darkest secrets. It was the kind of night that made you pull your coat tighter, the wind howling through the narrow streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts. On January 7, 1969, the students of Harvard University were returning from winter break, their minds focused on exams, papers, and upcoming thesis defenses. But for one student, Jane Britton, that day would be her last. And what happened inside her small apartment just off Harvard Square would spark one of the most haunting mysteries in the university's history. Jane was a 23-year-old graduate student at Harvard, deeply immersed in Near Eastern archaeology. Brilliant, confident, and known for her quick wit and intellect, she had recently returned from an archaeological dig in Iran. She spoke several languages, had a passion for ancient civilizations, and was well on her way to earning a doctorate. She was the kind of person who seemed destined for something great, but fate had other plans. On that Tuesday morning, Jane was supposed to meet her professor for an important exam, a crucial part of her graduate program. When she didn't show up, alarm bells went off almost immediately. This wasn't like Jane. She was responsible, punctual, and serious about her work. Her boyfriend and a close neighbor, also a student, decided to check on her. They climbed the narrow staircase to her apartment at 6 University Road and knocked on her door. No answer. Then, with dread sinking in, they tried the handle. The door was unlocked. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Jane was lying face down on her bed, still in her nightgown. Her body was partially covered with her own fur coat. There were visible head injuries. She had been struck with a blunt object, possibly more than once. There was blood, but that wasn't all. Red ochre, a kind of powder used in ancient burial rituals, was smeared around her body and on her mattress. There were traces of it in her apartment, including on the walls. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed random, but to someone like Jane, an archaeologist, it would have been chillingly symbolic. Was this murder somehow connected to her work? Was the killer trying to send a message? The discovery sent shockwaves through the Harvard community. Jane's murder was brutal, but it was also deeply puzzling. How had someone entered her apartment with no signs of forced entry? Why had they left her body in such a specific and eerie way? And what was the meaning of the red ochre, an ancient substance used in burials dating back thousands of years? Police rushed to the scene and began collecting evidence, but almost immediately they ran into dead ends. There was no murder weapon, no fingerprints, no clear indication of who had been in the apartment. Her purse was found inside, her belongings undisturbed. It didn't appear to be a robbery. There were no defensive wounds on Jane, leading some investigators to believe she had been attacked while she slept. As news of the crime spread, the media picked up the story. A young, intelligent Harvard woman murdered in her own apartment. It was front-page material, but with the media attention came rumors. Whispers began to circulate. Was Jane involved with Professor? Was someone jealous of her success? Had she discovered something dangerous on her archaeological dig overseas? In the days that followed, investigators interviewed classmates, friends, professors, even ex-boyfriends. Everyone had kind words for Jane. She was driven, outspoken, and passionate about her work. But despite the interviews, police found themselves spinning in circles. The red ochre baffled even the most seasoned detectives. Some believed it was a bizarre clue. Others thought it was a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators. The Harvard administration, meanwhile, tried to keep things quiet. They didn't want panic spreading across campus. But the damage had already been done. For the students, the murder shattered any illusion of safety. The idea that someone could enter your apartment in the middle of the night and kill you without leaving a trace was terrifying. Women began locking their doors. Students looked over their shoulders, and rumors turned into urban legends. In the midst of it all, Jane Britton's name became synonymous with mystery. And as investigators continued to hit wall after wall, one thing became painfully clear. Whoever killed her had planned it carefully, acted quickly, and disappeared without a trace. And this was only the beginning. From the moment Jane Britton's body was discovered, the investigation was anything but straightforward. The Cambridge police, joined by Massachusetts State Police and even Harvard's own security forces, scrambled to figure out what had happened. But the deeper they dug, the more confusing the case became. There was no sign of forced entry. Jane's apartment door was unlocked when her boyfriend and neighbor entered. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a secure building, which made it unlikely that someone just wandered in off the street. The window had been left slightly open, but there was no sign of a break-in there either. Some believed Jane may have known her killer and let them in willingly. Others suspected someone had followed her home and waited for the right moment to strike. As investigators examined the crime scene, they were met with more questions and answers. The strange presence of red ochre scattered around Jane's body was the most disturbing clue. Red ochre isn't something you'd find in a regular household. It's a pigment used in ancient burial rites, often symbolic of blood and rebirth. For someone who studied archaeology like Jane, it was deeply significant. Detectives began to wonder if this was some kind of message, perhaps from someone in her field, or someone who knew what the symbolism would mean. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. Some speculated that Jane had discovered something controversial during her time on the archaeological dig in Iran. Could she have brought something back? Had she offended someone by what she found or published? These theories were wild, but without hard evidence, nothing could be ruled out. The connection between her academic world and the red ochre became a key focus of the investigation. Detectives pored over her personal life. Jane had been in a relationship with another student, but there was no indication of conflict. She had a good relationship with her professors and was respected in her department. She wasn't known for reckless behavior, and there were no signs that she had been in any dangerous situations recently. Yet, someone had clearly targeted her, and done so in a way that suggested planning, not random violence. Over the following weeks, police interviewed dozens of people: friends, family members, faculty, and neighbors. One of the more intriguing leads came from a neighbor who recalled hearing footsteps in the hallway late that night, just hours before Jane was discovered. But they couldn't say who it was or whether it had anything to do with the murder. It was another frustrating dead end. With little forensic technology at the time, investigators were limited in what they could do. There was no DNA testing, and fingerprint analysis was still in its infancy. The killer had left behind no obvious clues, no messages, no traceable evidence. There were no witnesses, no surveillance cameras, and no one claiming to have seen anything suspicious. The case seemed to dissolve into thin air. As the investigation dragged on, the public grew increasingly uneasy. Harvard students, especially young women, were terrified. Some refused to live alone. Parents called the university demanding answers, but there were none. The university itself was accused of being tight-lipped, refusing to release certain details to avoid damaging its reputation. Some people even accused Harvard of trying to protect someone within the institution. After all, Jane was deeply embedded in the academic world. Could the killer be a professor? A researcher? A rival student? These theories fueled speculation for years. The case began to take on a life of its own, becoming more myth than reality. Over time, attention shifted away from Jane herself and toward the mystery surrounding her death. People forgot who she was, a young woman full of life with hopes, dreams, and a promising future. Instead, she became a ghost story whispered across campus dorms. Despite the lack of progress, investigators never fully closed the case. It remained open, if cold, sitting in a file drawer waiting for the day when something, anything, might finally break. Jane's family, particularly her brother, never stopped pushing for answers. He contacted journalists, wrote to law enforcement, and filed repeated requests for information over the decades. But for a long time, the response was always the same: no new leads. The trail had vanished, the evidence was limited, and the suspect, if there ever was one, seemed to have disappeared without a trace. And so, for nearly 50 years, the murder of Jane Britton stayed locked in mystery. The haunting symbols left at the scene, the silence of witnesses, and the absence of clues all combined into one of the most baffling unsolved crimes in Ivy League history. But What no one knew at the time was that the trail wasn't gone completely. It was just waiting for science to catch up. And in the decade that followed, that moment would finally come. As the years ticked by, the murder of Jane Britton transformed from a real-life tragedy into a chilling legend. On the campus of Harvard, where students come and go each semester, Jane's story was passed down like folklore. The details were often distorted. Some said she was found in a ritual circle. Others claimed she was involved in secret relationships, or that the red ochre meant some kind of curse. But underneath the myths was a very real and heartbreaking truth. A bright young woman had been brutally murdered, and no one had ever been held accountable. Her family was left to grieve in silence, never receiving the closure they so desperately sought. Jane's brother, Boy Britton, refused to let her memory fade into a myth. Over the decades, he fought tirelessly to keep the case alive. He reached out to law enforcement, wrote to reporters, and begged officials to reopen the investigation. But again and again, he was told the same thing. There were no new leads. It was as if Jane's killer had disappeared from the earth. Meanwhile, the Cambridge Police Department and the Middlesex County District Attorney's Office quietly held onto the case file. Though officially cold, it was never closed. But with time, so many crucial pieces of the puzzle had either vanished or degraded. Witnesses died, investigators retired, and the few physical clues left behind in 1969 had limited use with the forensic tools of the day. The most persistent theory that gripped public imagination was that Harvard itself had something to hide. There were whispers that someone powerful at the university might have been involved or at least connected to the case. Harvard had always protected its image with fierce determination. So, when rumors began circulating that Jane may have had a relationship with someone in a higher academic position, some began to wonder, was the investigation truly transparent? People questioned why the case hadn't got more attention from national media, why certain documents were kept confidential, and whether authorities were pressured to drop certain leads. To this day, there's no hard evidence proving Harvard interfered in any way, but the silence from the institution over the decades only added fuel to the conspiracy theories. Then came the most bizarre element of the story, the red ochre. Many believed it was too specific, too symbolic to be a coincidence. Jane had studied burial customs in ancient Mesopotamia and had just returned from an archaeological dig in Iran. She knew exactly what red ochre symbolized in ancient cultures: rebirth, blood, sacrifice. The fact that her killer used it, whether deliberately or by accident, opened the door to wild speculation. Was this a message from a fellow archaeologist, a former colleague from the dig site, or was it a twisted attempt to make her death resemble an ancient burial ritual? Despite the strange circumstances, police could never establish a clear link between the ochre and any suspect. No fingerprints were found on the substance. No witness reported seeing anything unusual, and no other crimes in the area involved similar patterns. It was just another dead end in a case full of mysteries. And yet, Jane's case refused to be forgotten. Journalists occasionally revisited the story in local newspapers. True crime writers and bloggers speculated about suspects, often revisiting old theories or highlighting people who had lived near Jane at the time. Over time, the internet breathed new life into the cold case community, and amateur sleuths began discussing the Britton case online. For Jane's family, the lack of answers was a constant source of pain, but they also held on to hope. Hope that maybe someday new technology could uncover what old methods could not. Hope that someone, somewhere, might remember something that had once seemed insignificant. Hope that justice, though delayed, could still arrive. Still, nearly 5 decades after Jane's murder, it felt like that hope was fading. The case had been dormant for so long, and those with the power to pursue it further seemed uninterested or unwilling. Even though her file remained open, it seemed more like a formality than a real commitment to finding her killer. Yet, what no one realized at the time was that a silent revolution was taking place in the world of forensic science. DNA technology was advancing rapidly, and techniques once considered impossible were now being used to solve the coldest of cases. All that was needed was one preserved clue, just one piece of evidence that had been stored carefully enough to yield a genetic fingerprint. Jane Britton's case, long buried beneath rumors and red tape, was about to be unearthed in the most unexpected way. The silence was about to be broken, not by confession, but by science. For nearly 50 years, Jane Britton's case sat in the archives, dusty, dormant, and unresolved. But in the background, science had been quietly sharpening its tools. The turning point came in 2018, when the Middlesex County District Attorney's Office made a bold decision. They would take one last shot at solving the case, using modern DNA technology that hadn't existed in 1969. It all began with a simple question. Was there any preserved evidence from the original crime scene that could now be tested? As it turned out, there was. Back in 1969, investigators had collected various samples from Jane's apartment, including scrapings from under her fingernails, swabs from the bedding, and biological material found on her clothing. These items have been stored for decades, long before anyone knew how valuable they would one day become. And in a rare stroke of luck, some of that evidence had been properly preserved. Forensic scientists began re-examining the samples, this time using advanced techniques to extract DNA profiles. What they found would finally change everything. There, hidden in the evidence for almost 5 decades, was a DNA profile belonging to a man. It didn't match anyone in law enforcement databases. That meant it wasn't someone with a prior criminal conviction. But that didn't mean the trail had ended. Using a method called genetic genealogy, investigators turned to public DNA databases like GeneMatch, sites where people upload their DNA to trace family trees or find long-lost relatives. With the help of forensic genealogists, the unknown DNA sample was compared against others in the system, not looking for a perfect match, but for relatives, people who shared a genetic connection. Over weeks of painstaking research, they built a family tree around the unknown DNA. It led them to a name that no one had expected, Michael Sumter. At the time of Jane Britton's murder, Sumter was 27 years old and living in the Boston area. He had a criminal record for rape and assault. In fact, he had been convicted of multiple violent attacks on women in Massachusetts during the 1970s. But here was the twist. Sumter had died in 2001. He had taken his secrets to the grave, until now. To confirm the connection, investigators reached out to surviving members of Sumter's family and requested DNA samples. When those samples came back, they matched the DNA found on Jane Britton's body. There was no longer any doubt. Michael Sumter had been in her apartment that night in 1969. He was her killer. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. After 50 years of silence, the truth had finally come out. The case that once seemed destined to remain a mystery was now solved. Not through a confession or a surprise witness, but through the relentless power of science. The news was bittersweet. Jane's family finally had answers, but the man responsible would never face justice in a courtroom. There would be no trial, no sentencing, no jail time. Still, for Jane's brother, Boyd, it was a long-awaited moment of clarity. He told reporters that while it didn't bring Jane back, knowing the truth helped bring an end to the endless loop of wondering, guessing, and hoping. He had lived for decades with a hole in his heart, and though the wound remained, it had finally been named. What's perhaps most haunting is that Sumter had never been on the police's radar in 1969, despite his later crimes. He had not yet established a pattern that would define his criminal career, and after Jane's murder, he simply slipped through the cracks, blending back into society until his later arrests. He was a predator hiding in plain sight. What made the discovery even more chilling was the realization that Jane wasn't his only victim. Authorities confirmed that Sumter had also committed at least 2 other rapes in the same area during the 1970s. In one case, he had even been convicted, yet no one ever connected him to Jane. The puzzle pieces had been sitting in different boxes until DNA brought them together. The identification of Michael Sumter was not only a victory for Jane's case, but a testament to the growing power of forensic science. It served as a warning to killers. Time no longer guarantees freedom. Even decades later, your DNA can and likely will speak for you. And for those still waiting for justice in other cold cases, Jane Britton's story lit a spark of hope. Her case reminded the world that even the oldest mysteries can still be solved. With the mystery finally solved after 50 long years, many believe the chapter on Jane Britton's murder had closed. But in truth, The story didn't end with the identification of Michael Sumter. For Jane's family, for her friends, and even for those who only came to know her through the headlines, the answers raised as many emotions as the questions ever had. And most haunting of all, her absence and the silence she left behind still echoes today. For Jane's brother, Boy Britton, the confirmation of Sumter as a killer brought long-awaited clarity, but not relief. There's never closure, he told the media. Closure suggests that something is complete. But how can the murder of someone you love ever truly be complete? For him, the case had consumed decades of letters, requests, and painful waiting. The truth, however delayed, had arrived, but the pain remained just beneath the surface. And then there was Harvard. For years, many critics had accused the institution of staying too quiet, of not doing enough, or even of suppressing information to avoid scandal. When the news broke in 2018, Harvard issued a formal statement expressing condolences to the Britton family and praising law enforcement for finally resolving the case. But that statement did little to erase decades of suspicion from the public. For some, the silence had gone on too long to be forgiven. Still, the red ochre, perhaps the most symbolic and chilling detail of the crime scene, remained a mystery. Investigators never determined for certain if it was used intentionally or if it had been present in Jane's apartment due to her archaeological work. Some believe that Sumter might have scattered it in an effort to confuse police or to create a dramatic scene. Others argued that it was Jane's own supply, used unintentionally by the killer. We may never know for sure, but its presence left a mark, not only on the investigation, but on the legacy of the case. What remains just as tragic as the murder itself is how Jane's promising life was cut short. She wasn't just a murder victim or a mystery to be solved. She was a brilliant, passionate, and warm young woman with dreams of traveling the world, exploring ancient civilizations, and contributing something meaningful to history. Those who knew her remember her laugh, her curiosity, and her fierce intellect. Her professors had praised her work ethic. Her classmates recalled how she lit up the room with her presence. And yet for decades, her story was reduced to theories, rumors, and ghostly retellings passed between Harvard students. Now, with her case solved, there was finally a chance to shift the narrative back to who she was, not just how she died. In the years since the case's resolution, Jane Britton's story has taken on a new meaning for cold case investigators, students of criminal justice, and advocates for victims' families. It's become a powerful reminder that no matter how long it takes, justice is always worth pursuing. Advances in DNA technology have changed the way law enforcement approaches cold cases, and Jane's case has been used as a case study in the power of perseverance. But even as technology evolves, it was never just a science that solved Jane's case. It was a refusal to give up, the determination of her brother, the quiet commitment of detectives who kept the file open, and the belief, shared by many, that the truth always finds a way. Michael Sumter may have escaped justice in life, but he didn't escape it in death. The walls he built around his crimes eventually crumbled. And with that, the silence that surrounded Jane's murder was broken, not with screams or accusations, but with facts. Cold, undeniable, scientific truth. Yet as a final word on the case was written, one haunting question remained. How many other stories like Jane's are still waiting to be solved? Her story may now be complete, but her legacy continues to ripple through the halls of Harvard and the wider world. Jane Britton's life was tragically short, but her story stands as a lasting symbol for justice delayed, for persistence of truth, and for the idea that even after half a century, a voice can still be heard through the silence. And that voice is still speaking today. After 50 years of silence, justice finally spoke. If this story gripped you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that the world forgot, but we never will. Hit the bell icon to never miss an untold mystery.